In this movie, I'll show you how to use the Shadows Highlights command to correct or at least make better an image that has far too much contrast. So in my case, I have this pretty low quality image here that features this backlit barracuda. And so the barracuda's body is exhibiting these very, very dark shadows, and it's set against these overly sharp highlights in the background. And so here inside the histogram panel, I'm going to change that channel setting to luminosity. And notice, if I go ahead and update the histogram, that we have a very spiky histogram indeed, with an awful lot of shadows running against the left-hand side of the graph, and a ton of highlights running into the right side of the graph. And then we have this big dip in the midtones. And that is the sign of a hot, high-contrast image. And so one thing we could do is bring up the adjustments panel by clicking on that black and white circle, and then Alt-click or Option-click on the brightness contrast icon, and I'll go ahead and call this guy Contrast Down, for example, and then I'll reduce the contrast value to its absolute minimum of -50. And that does virtually nothing. It makes a slight contribution, but nothing like what we need. We still have these shadows running into the left side of the graph. We have these highlights that are starting to separate right there, and we still have a big dip in the midtones. So that is obviously not going to do the trick. So I'll just hide the properties panel and press the backspace key here on the PC or the delete key on the Mac to get rid of that layer. The solution is to go to the image menu, choose adjustments, and then choose shadows highlights. Now you might reasonably ask, wait a second here. If you apply this command, you're going to apply a static adjustment, correct? And the answer is yes, I will be. In which case, then why aren't we using an adjustment layer? And the answer is that Shadows Highlights is not available as an adjustment layer inside Photoshop. So I'll go ahead and choose the command, and notice that it has these two seemingly simple sliders here. If you increase the shadows amount value, then you'll open up the shadows, which is another way of saying brightening the shadows so that we can see into them. And if I increase the highlights amount value, then I'll darken up the highlights like so. And notice how I am now spreading the shadows into the midtones, and I'm also spreading the highlights into the midtones, so we have a very differently shaped histogram. Now, you don't need to get too worried about the fact that it's sliced off at the top. Even though that's generally a bad thing, this histogram isn't going to be altogether accurate until after we click OK. Now, notice, if you will, that even though I've done quite the job of reducing the contrast so that the barracuda is more visible against its background, see these weird little bright halos that are showing up around the fish's body? And if you look closely enough, you can find some dark halos inside the fish as well. Well, we can get rid of those, but it comes at the expense of the simplicity of this dialog box. What you have to do, if you really want control over what's going on, you have to turn on this checkbox, show more options, and then you are going to expand the heck out of this dialog box, and we are going to see lots more settings. Now, the only ones we have to worry about are these radius values right here. They control the size of the halos. So what you want to do is just increase those values to about 200 pixels. For both the shadows radius value and for the highlights radius value. Just pop them up to 200 pixels, and your halos become so large and dispersed that they're really not visible anymore. You also want to take this colors value right here down to 0, because otherwise you're going to increase the intensity of the colors inside your image, and you really don't want to do that. And now you can go ahead and set the amount values to whatever seems appropriate. In my case, I'm going to keep things simple by setting both the shadows amount and the highlights amount to 50%, like so. And now I want you to see the histogram again. Notice the top is still shaved off, but as soon as I go ahead and click OK, in order to accept that change, we get a much better contoured histogram. And now if I click on the update button, you can see that it looks to be in pretty darn good shape. So notice that we now have these tapering shadows as well as these mostly tapering highlights. We still have some spiky action right there at the end, and there's not really anything we can do about the so-called specular highlights right here that are dancing off the surface of the water. But we now have a ton of midtones, which is a really great thing. So just to give you a sense of the difference here, I'll go ahead and press Shift-F to switch directly to the full screen mode, and then I'll zoom in on my image. And if I press Control or Command-Z, this is how the image looked when I first opened it. And then if I press Control or Command-Z again, This is how it looks now, thanks to our ability to settle down the highlights and open up the shadows in an extremely high contrast image here inside Photoshop.